Hello and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, no matter what it is that you're doing. For the free wire-based tutorial on YouTube today, I'd like to bring to you my Sakura and Pagoda artwork. Now you absolutely can wear this as jewellery. Lots of people will wear a Tree of Life design. There's one example using gemstone chips. Those are little Wello opals. And then I have ones made with faceted rounds. These are Peruvian opals, just like opals really. So there's two really quite different looks dependent on whether you're going to be using gemstone chips or more even beads. Can be completely stylised to your personal preference. As I say, you can wear it as jewellery or you could wear that as wall art. Let's take a closer look at those. So here's a slightly closer look at the examples I showed you a second ago. The one on the right has the gemstone chips of Ethiopian opal. And then the one on the left has far fewer blossoms on the Sakura tree. But I really like opal in this design. These are Peruvian faceted 2mm rounds. And we're going to work in a couple of different wires today, dependent on what shows up best in the camera. But there are three main gauges. So the outer framework is 1.25 or 16 gauge. The Pagoda is made with 1mm or 18 gauge. And the tree is made with 0.4mm or 26 gauge. The infill on the Pagoda is also made with 0.4 or 26 gauge. So I'm going to take you through those pieces step by step, and I hope that you love these as much as I do. So you'll notice just briefly on this one, if I flip it over so you can see the back, you could wear it the other way around if you wanted to see more of the Pagoda. This has no beads in the Pagoda at all. It's quite stylised Pagoda. I've got a couple of different varieties to share with you as we move through. And then the other piece has far more of a skeletal tree, far fewer blossoms. You can see a bit more of the Pagoda. That one looks a bit like a Christmas tree, doesn't it? But I've got some different designs to share with you as we go through. So three main wires that we're going to be working with. Let's just pop those up and out of the way for now. So we're going to start off by creating the Pagoda segment. Now I'm going to use both copper and silver today throughout parts of the tutorial, just because it shows up quite nicely when you're doing a little bit of weaving. So I have to begin with 18 inches of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. This is round wire and I'm working currently with raw copper, but I'll be demonstrating later with a medium temper silver plated as well. So I'm just going to run that between thumb and forefinger to warm that up in the central section to begin with. I'm not going to go too close along to the edges, we just need those to be down and out of the way to begin with. So the first set of pliers we're going to use are our round nose pliers, and that's just to create a section up at the top of that Pagoda. So I'm just going to pop those round nose pliers in, approximately centralised, and I'm going to create a small loop shape. Now this can be added to the top of the design if you want to make your Pagoda really tall, but it's just really a point to start. So I've got a loop, or a slightly angular loop in this case. I might flatten that top out actually. Looks quite pretty, something a bit different. And what we're going to do is bring that back into a completely 2D design, so nothing's going to cross over at any point. So I'm going to open out those wires. If I just get them opened out, then you can see exactly where it is we're getting to. So I'm just gripping with my bent chain nose pliers underneath, trying to get that to look a little bit more symmetrical. So you could have a completely round form up at the top if you wanted to pop a bead in, as I did with this one. Completely optional. You design your Pagoda how you want it to be. So what we're going to do is just make the first section. So the roofs tend to be reasonably angular. They're not terribly shallow. They're not terribly steep. So you take a look at your pagodas and see what you fancy. I've got another couple of examples here that we're going to work with a bit later. So I felt that one looked a bit Christmas tree-like, but I still like it, and I'm still going to use it. I might just put a bit more tree over the front of that one. The one that we're going to work with in a moment is this design, which is a little bit more waisted. So you've got these little waist sections before the next floor, the next tier comes down. And in all of my pagoda designs, they start small and then they get larger as they come closer to the ground. If you look at pagodas, there's all kinds of different designs out there. Some of them stay reasonably the same size. So it's whatever your aesthetic preferences are, you can design the pagoda to fit that remit. So what we're going to do to begin with is just get some nice angles for the first or uppermost tier of our pagoda, and I'm going to make sure that I'm happy with those 2 angles to begin with. I'm just going to pop the wire into the centre of the board whilst I grab from the reel my 0.4 or 26 gauge wire. So I've just got to find the end there, and then we're going to attach that up near the little section that we made up at the top. Now I work from the reel, however it uses, for a pagoda of about this size, which is maybe 2¼ inches tall, that used a good 6 feet of that finer gauge wire. So it's up to you whether you want to unspool 6 feet and have that knocking things off the desk, or whether you want to make life slightly trickier and keep it attached to the spool. I'm going to move these out of the way because otherwise I will attack them in a second. I'm going to lay a little length over the end, just up on one side near the top. And I'm going to wrap that around 3 times. Now if you do want to put a bead in up at the top, what you will need to do, let me just undo that a section, straighten that out. What you could do, in fact, to keep your options open, is take a good 2 inches past over the top of the design, wrap that around 3 times, and you could just leave that hanging around. That gives you an option to then add a bead in later if you wish to, and I may show you how to do that in a little while, but it's basically a case of adding a bead onto the cut end and then wrapping 3 times on the opposite side. We're just going to leave that hanging around so we have an option. You could also use that to attach your pagoda. If you want it to go all the way to the top of the design, you could attach it to that circular form. In my design, the tree supports the pagoda as we move through. So the spool is going to get in the way slightly, so I'm just going to draw that over to the other side for a second. And all we're going to do is a figure of 8 weave. So I've wrapped 3 times around on the left up at the top of the pagoda roof. So I'm going to draw the wire down the centre, bring it underneath on the right hand side, and this is very, very standard weaving rules apply. So we're going to go for 3 wraps around one side and then switch it back to the other side. So that's 3 neat and tidy wraps here. I'm going to take the form and switch that around so that I can bring the wire through and wrap 3 times on the second side. The wire comes down the centre, switches back over to the opposite side. So it is just a case of putting some tension into the design as you move through it. I'm going to do a couple more of these. So that's 1, that's 2, and that's 3. Swap the wire back over to the other side. Now the reason I'm swinging the design around is because I have my massive spool of wire over on the other side. That's a ½ kilo of finer gauge wire and I don't want it on my toe. So we're just switching from one side to the other. So when your roof starts to get to the size that you want to see it, let me just bring an example in. So as I said earlier, mine are graduating up. They're becoming larger as they move closer to the floor. You can do exactly the same size over and over again. You can have much wider segments between each tier of the design. Have a look with your favourite search engine and see what you fancy doing. As you get to the very end of your design, when you're up on the first tier rather, what you will need to do is to turn an angle. Now I tried making this about 17 or 18 times to make it as simple as possible. So what I'm going to do is very, very quickly just do a little bit more weaving to the end of that top tier. So I might get the technical department to just speed this up, or we might just fade it out for a second. I'm going to continue doing the exact same process. So I've decided this is the approximate size I want the top tier of my pagoda to be. So what I've done is I've woven up to the size that I like. I'm going to make sure that my weaving is nice and taut and firmly squished into position. And what I'm going to do is take my pliers just past the point at which I want that floor or that tier to end. And I'm going to pull that around and make sure I get a reasonable angle on both sides. So again, I'm taking the tip of the pliers just a little bit away from the end of that weaving before folding it back into itself. So we've got long tails of wire either side, which are just a little bit tricky when you've got a camera. And what we want to do is to bring those so that they sit opposite one another, like so. So they're just crossing over for the time being. What we then need to do is the side where you are still attached with your wire, we're going to make that bend first. And I think for this design, we're going to have quite wide segments up the centre. So I'm going to pull very, very firmly down with the pliers and then try to replicate that exact same dimension on the other side. So whichever way you want to do it, you can use the pliers to make the bend, or you can use your finger to make the bend past the end of the pliers. So you can see this side is slightly longer. So because we warmed that wire first, we have the opportunity to just slightly manoeuvre that over a little bit. Now I'm taking great care here to not press my pliers down on that finer gauge wire. You may damage it where it might crack if you are too heavy-handed. So you can see that the weaving doesn't go all the way to the very, very end, because otherwise it falls off. So you need to have a little naked bit of wire at the edges, and you can just fiddle around with that until it sits exactly how you want it to. So what we're going to do now is weave into the centre section of the pagoda. So I'm going to bring my wire all the way across. So we're coming from the left hand side over the top. So that means I now need to go to the right hand side and underneath that wire. So I'm going to continue the exact same weaving 3 times around like so. Push that up nice and tight. Make sure that your centralised section is quite straight. You might like to take a moment to just give that a little bit of firmening. That's definitely not a word. Strengthening is probably an actual word. So then we would continue with that 3 and 3 basket weave going across that central section. 2 and a 3rd wrap before crossing back to the other side. So I'm going to pop this out of the way and bring one that I prepared earlier, and we'll just have a quick look at that design. So you can see once I've added the number of tiers I would like, and you can play with the angles. As I say, this one comes down a bit and then flares out before going back and being a slight underhang just here. Straight section in the centre, slight angle change part the way along that tier or that roof line before it underhangs again, and then I finish down at the base. When I got to the base, I took the right handmost wire all the way around. Let me just show you. Just open that out for a second, and this side too. So I put right angle bends when I reached the lowest tier, and then it's just a case of by hand, or if you prefer, you could use one of these little cool doohickeys or any round form that you have, just to put a nice round shape on those 2 sideways parts of wire. So they're just slightly drawn back. It's not a massive problem. It's just to get a fairly good arc to begin with, and I would need to tighten those over slightly anyway. So that's the first part of our tutorial. So as I mentioned, you could take a look at your favourite search engine and see what kind of form you want your pagoda to take. But we start with the pagoda. If you've not done any weaving before, the main thing is every time you do those 3 little wraps on one side, scooch it up. Either sacrifice your nails like I do, or use the smooth side of your chain nose pliers just to scooch those little coils up so that they're nice and neat. We're looking to fill the form with as much woven wire as possible. Doesn't have to be a 3 and 3, it could be a 2 and 2, could be a 4 and 4, whatever you want it to be. It does look nice when you have the same number of coils on either side of the wire roofs though. So let's head back down for the next section, which is adding the tree. So for the next section, what we're going to do is take some finer gauge wire and to create a tree on one side of the pagoda form. Now I'm using a round form which isn't tapered. This is the same diameter all the way through, but you could use a bangle mandrel or any other round form such as a tin of soup if you prefer, whatever it is that you've got to hand which fits with your dimension ideals. So again, once you've got that round form, you can just smooth it slightly smaller or slightly larger, however it works for you. So I will just show you very, very quickly how you can add a bead on before we go any further, because I forgot to do that. So if you did want to add a bead at the top of your pagoda, it's a very, very simple process. I'm going to add one of these round faceted Peruvian opals that I have a half strand left of. And it's just a case of taking the cut tail of wire, making sure that that's on your neatest face. So you can see we've got 3 wraps on the left. So what I'm going to do, just to even things up, is bring that over underneath, so we're not going up over the top, down the centre and underneath. I've gone from underneath to underneath because I want my cut tail of wire to go across the surface. So we're going to go for 3 little wraps after we've done 1 straight line across the back, and then we're going to pop that bead on. I've slightly kinked the end of the wire there, so it might take a second. It didn't. Happy days, that makes a change. So if I take the spool of wire out of the way, all you would do is then take the tail of that wire and wrap that 3 times around to make the bead sit centrally in the form that you created. Now, because we laid a good couple of inches of that finer gauge wire over the surface, you've also still got now about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch of wire remaining in case you wanted to attach that to the top of the form for strength. You don't have to. I'm not going to. I'm going to use my tree to support that. So that's how you set the bead. If you want to trim that wire away, just flip that over to the back, take that 3rd pass of wire over, trim the correct piece of wire, look twice, cut once, and then what we're going to do is just cover the bead up whilst we take that cut end and make that as neat and as tidy as possible. So we've set a little bead up at the top. You don't have to, but it's a nice aesthetic if you wish to add that in. So to create the tree, it's almost an identical process to the other Tree of Life designs that I've shared with you in the past. I have here to one side in silver coloured wire, this time still round, still copper core, and I have 7 lengths. They're approximately 12 inches each of 26 gauge or 0.4mm gauge wire. Now you can work with slightly shorter lengths than that if you wish to. I much prefer to have a longer length of wire because it means that I can play around with lots more twists and turns in the tree as we go. I'm going to set my tree to the left of the pagoda in this instance. You could put it whichever side you wanted to. So we've got this circular form coming away from the base of the pagoda, and what we want to do is one at a time add the central section of our lighter gauge length of wire around where we want the tree to stand. So I'm going to lay that over the top, just about in the centre of that cut length of wire. I'm going to pull one end all the way around so that I get 1 and 2 passes of wire down at the base. I'm then going to push those now 2 tails of wire, and I'm just going to slide those out of the way for a second whilst I add the next section of wire into position. Now if you want to, you can be very cautious and make sure that your wires are all sitting in the same formation. So if I look at the tail of wire that we have sat already into position, once it's scooched around, the leftmost tail of wire is sitting underneath the frame. So I'm going to draw the wire around from the other side so that we've got 2 wraps of wire, tighten those up neatly and scooch that down. So those are now sitting, left is underneath, right is over, left is underneath, right is over. At the end of the day, these are tree roots, and tree roots don't tend to follow left-right rules. It's just a thought. If you want it to have some essence of symmetry, if that's a thing that will bother you later, now's the time to think about it. So I'm just going to show you one more, and then I'll add the other 4 off camera. So again, because my leftmost wire is underneath, I'm going to push that up into the frame, and then I'm going to draw the tail around once and twice. If If you wanted it to be 3 times, you absolutely can, but it means that the roots gap further apart. Now that's not very neat and tidy, so I'm just going to give that a very, very gentle coerce with my pliers to get that looking neat. And then just while you're having a bit of a break, I'm going to add the next 4 on in exactly the same way. Now I've used 7 lengths of wire, which gives us 14 branches to work with because we use the central segment to add on to the frame. If you want a much more bushy tree, then absolutely just up the number that you use. The number of lengths of wire you use doubled is how many branches you will end up with. Now occasionally when we're twisting the tree, you might shed a branch. So if you think that you're going to be a little bit heavy-handed and there's a risk that you might twist some of those wire pieces off, just so that they snap, add more to begin with. You can always trim some away if there's too many and just smooth it down so there's no nasty ends to catch on things. I'll show you the next stage of that tree tutorial now. So I've added on my 7 lengths of wire to create these 14 segments that are now just all pulling away to one side. Now what I like to do is just give that a quick warm through and get them to sit really closely together down at the bottom. Now there are a couple of different ways that you can make your tree roots come together to form the trunk. You could grab a couple at a time, so I could go for like 3 maybe at a time and just gently hold them at the point that they wrap around, and then just give that a quick twist. And I'm being very careful, I'm not using tools at the moment, I'm just taking those lengths of wire around. This does shed your fingertips slightly. And then I'll do the other side as well. So I guess that was 4 on that side and 3 on this side. So I'm just going to twist those around gently, and then I'm going to smash them together and create one mega trunk. Now you can just do that from the get-go, just bring all of those 7 wires together at one time. Now to get some tension onto this piece, what we need to do is just get some purchase further up the trunk. Now the more you rub the wire with warmth now, the weaker it will become when we're trying to work it later. With your heavier gauges of wire, it makes sense to warm them plentifully, but with the lighter gauges of wire, what can happen is that you overwork it too soon. So you can see we've got good purchase on the tree. The tree has become one trunk now. So what I'm going to do is very, very carefully just pinch all of those wires and twist them. You can use gloves to do this if you prefer. If you can see we've already lost 1 wire. I would have kinked one of those wires as we were working, and sometimes they just fall away. Now I'm not going to edit that out, I'm going to show you that it does happen. So that's going in the scrap pot. We now have 13 branches. So whatever you want to do about that, not a problem. Very, very carefully I'm just going to tighten up the trunk at the base. Now you need to have a careful hand when you're doing this. If you press too hard, you're going to shed all of your branches. If you've got good grip strength between thumb and forefinger on your dominant hand, then you don't need the pliers at all. What we're going to do now is to draw the trunk of the tree up above the base of the pagoda. So if I put that back into its final orientation, you'll see what it's starting to look like. Now I really like having twisty trunks on my Sakura trees. You don't have to have them twisty, you can have them quite straight, it's entirely up to you. So I think I'm going to put a bit more tension into this before we move on. Now again, I would say just be careful. We don't want to break too many of those wires away, and if you end up, now I've done it on purpose here, there's a section of wire that's slightly proud, that's fine, absolutely fine, it just adds to the natural look of the tree. So once we've got a bit more branch, that's the end of the one that we lost earlier. What we want to do is put a little bit of drama into that tree. Let's get the pagoda back into its proper orientation and lay the tree trunk over the top. So I'm actually quite happy with how that is looking. This section that became truncated, if that happens to you, I really don't think you need to worry about it overall, but I'm actually going to use that to my advantage. What I'm going to do is load a couple of gemstone chips onto this truncated section. Now me threading beads is literally the dullest thing in the world, so I'm not going to show you this over and over again. In fact, it's really handy to have a slightly shorter one, because it means that I can just show you the basics of the idea without you having to sit through the painful process of me putting beads on wire, because I can't really see, if I'm honest. So what I'm going to do now is secure my tree to the pagoda, and what this does is just make an attractive addition to the design. So I might put one more on the end there. It also strengthens the whole unit together. So I'm going to put one more bead on the end of this foreshortened branch. Now opals will snap, especially like this. They're quite a delicate thing when they're in this format. So if I lose a bead or two here, I'm not going to be too sad. What I'm going to do is lay the branch across the pagoda, flip the design over, and you can see we've got just a small amount of wire at the end here. And what I'm going to do is take the end of that and find a hole in the design just on the underhang of one of those floor sections, and I'm simply going to wrap around the stronger, that 1mm wire that we started making the pagoda with. So I reckon I could get 2 good turns on there. Just going to hide that end away into the design. Now you will need to be careful that you're not snapping the beads by putting any pressure on them. Some beads as chips are absolutely fine, but basically chip beads in the jewellery industry are bits that have broken off, and then somebody puts a drill hole through them, so they will already have seen some drama in their little gemstone lives. So they tend to be just a little bit fragile. So let's have a look and see what that looks like on the front. I'm actually quite happy with that. You could just tighten up where that sits. Now, to create a little bit more interest in the tree itself, what I'm going to do is take a good wedge of those branches, probably about, let's make it about 1/3, and have 2/3 coming upwards and 1/3 of those remaining branches going over to the side. You can twist them if you need to, and you have a gentle touch. You can help with your pliers. So what I'm doing is I'm making a sub branch from the trunk now. Very, very carefully. What I'm doing is I'm trying to catch those wires flat. I'm not pressing them down together where they're crossing over. So if you find a section of wires, smooth them out so that they're flat. You can see that that's just a single layer of wires now. I'm going to grip that and twist it around. The same thing again. And what you get then is a little sub branch. So I'm going to make that a little bit journey-tastic. So that's coming over to the side. You see we've got a slightly loose bit there. If you get one of those, you can just sneak it around until it disappears. So what we would then do is fill these little branches over here. Let's see how many there are coming away on this side. So I've got 4 altogether. So what I might do here is twist 2 of them together to make almost twig-like structures, like that. And then I would add some beads and secure it to the round section. Again, with the next 2, I would give those a couple of twists before adding beads, and then securing with at least 3 twists around that outer framework. The other 2/3 of wires that we have going away to the top, the tree is going to grow a little bit upwards. And again, you need to have a delicate touch, or make sure that your wires are in single formation before you start using that twisting technique. If you do it by hand, you're likely to have far fewer incidences of the wire snapping. So again, I'm going to make my trunk interesting. And the natural bushing apart of the wires up at the top is really handy. So I'm going to separate that main trunk into 2 sub-trunks, like so. And then I've got a few more coming off in the opposite direction. So I have got a couple of tutorials for tree of life designs or tree designs in artwork, where we discuss kind of the more artistic nature of how these bits and pieces bush apart. What I wanted to do was to have a tree with blossom next to a pagoda, which is what this design is all about. So all I'm going to do here is just separate out these last couple of wires. We've only had 1 loss so far, which is pretty cool. So what I would do here is separate these into 2 sections, 2 bundles, give them a few more twists on either side. And then with these ones, I'd probably take 1 off by itself, and then the other 2 up northerly, so sort of growing up towards the sun. And then one of these I would fill with beads up to about here. So let's do that. Let's just do that section. I don't need to fill all of these because it's literally just threading beads on and then taking it all the way out to the edge. We're going to show you now how to secure the pagoda to the tree and give the design itself some strength. So I'm going to add on a couple of beads, and again, opal isn't the greatest choice because opal slivers like this are very, very delicate and they're quite likely to snap if you put even the tiniest bit of pressure on them. So something like an agate or a carnelian, you can get some very, very beautiful and inexpensive gems. So once I've reached just before the margin of the pagoda on the opposite side, so I grew my tree on the left, so where it passes the pagoda on the right, let's add one or two more. 1 and 2. What I'm going to do is lift the branch slightly away, take the end and pass it in between the weaving on the pagoda and pull that so that it sits through. What you can then do is draw the wire around and just wrap it one time around the side of the pagoda. Pull that nice and tight. If you're cautious, you can get that wire to just disappear. It will just simply not be a visible thing. Like so. You can just hide that away before bringing the wire forwards again, and then the tree has grown through the pagoda. If you don't want it to grow through the pagoda, you can just put a load of beads on that are kind of one-sided and get them to sit over the gap so it just looks like it passes in front. Then you would fill that all the way to the other side. I'm going to take a few moments now to just fill those branches with beautiful opal nuggets and chips, just to get those to be all lovely and bushy and in blossom in the springtime. And then I'll join back with you in a few moments and show you how to add the frame in to make it nice and strong and long lasting. So I filled in most of the branches with those gorgeous little nuggety gemstones which are opals from Ethiopia. And what I've done, just to add a little bit of interest, is I'm crossing some of the branches over. So I just lift this one up a little bit. You can see it's come from over here on the right. I put some lovely little twists in the wire here, and I'm laying it over one of the other branches. Let's just get this bit at the top out of the way. And I'm just going to show you how you would attach the finer branch wire onto that frame once you have filled each of those branches in. So I'm just going to use a 3 wrap around the frame wire. So when you're getting in neat and tidy, when things are getting a bit tighter, you might wish to use a pair of pliers just to help you get that rotation of wire started. Pull that nice and firmly. This is usually the stage at which an opal will chip or crack, and they sometimes fall off, but I just imagine it's blossom falling off the tree. So you can go for 5 rotations around that frame wire, but 3 is adequate. These are very light little beads, and what you would do each time you have added one of those branches on is trim away and then take that little tail of wire all the way around, just very, very gently rotating those plier tips around until that's nice and smooth. So we have our pagoda in place and we have the Sakura tree over the front, and I've added a little bit more 3D detail with this one just by twisting those branches around. So what I'm going to do now is add in some of the heavier wire. This is around about a 12-inch length of 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire. So I'm going to use the same round form that we used earlier to create that round shape with the tails of wire that come from the base of the pagoda. I'm just going to warm that through at the centre and then just create a basic round form. Again, you can use whatever round surface you have available. I'm just going to cross that over, and that's 12 inches or so of the 1.25mm gauge. So it will spring out slightly, which is fine. And the next thing we're going to do is to tie everything together. So if I just lay those side by side, what I want to do is for the larger frame wire to fit outside. So if you don't have a mandrel which is tapered, you can very carefully just open up the same sized round form shape and get that to sit where you need it to. So we're looking for it to be just a little bit larger. So what we can do is add in a little weaving. I'm just going to take this out of the way for a second and show you a couple of examples. So this is just a 3 weave on the outside with a single wrap on the inside, trying to keep the distance between the outer frame and the inner frame fairly similar, so it acts as a border. So this tree's got quite a lot of petals on it. This one is much more skeletal. Both of these have pieces of wire which pass through the pagoda, and that stops it from moving about. You could indeed take the height of the pagoda up to the top and just use the tail of the wire from where we added that decorative bead and wrap it around either the inner or the outer frame, and you can finish the bail however you want. This is a very simple bail. This is a slightly more decorative bail that I would use for using it as jewellery. A very simple bail like this you can still use for jewellery obviously, but then you have the option of making something a little bit more intricate if you want to wear it rather than hang it. Just pop some ribbon through either way around. So that's what we're going to do next. We're just going to tie the inner frame to the outer frame and make it nice and strong, and you can finish off that bail however you please. I've done enough tutorials on bails for you to have your choice available to you. Now I'm going to use a different coloured wire just so that it's easy to see. Now I think probably around about 24 inches of wire would be the smart thing to use. That will be more than enough, but it's better than having it run out part of the way through. Now I'm going to go again for a single wrap around the inner frame and a triple wrap around the outer frame, and because we have points at which things attach to that inner frame, you'll just need to work around wherever you can find spaces to attach things. So right down at the bottom you've got the base of the pagoda, and what we need to do is just wind several times around the outer frame wire to fill in that gap. It gives it quite a nice little footprint on the design. So if I find the centre of my lighter wire, and this again is around about 18 inches of 0.4 or 26 gauge, I'm finding the bottom centre of my heavy frame wire, and I'm just going to wrap around that several times until I have filled in the gap. Now in the sense of expediency today, I'm going to do a very open coil. In the other designs I've done a completely closed coil beneath the pagoda and beneath the roots of the tree, and that's just because 3 wires and a sideways slant would look a little bit strange, so I filled it in. But like I said, we're going to go for an open weave just to take less time up. So I think one more around and then draw the wire up and through. I'm just going to show you how to start the weave, as it is indeed very basic, and I've been going on quite a long time today. So just check that your outer frame wire is going to be skirting around at about the same distance all the way. So what I'm going to do here is take the tail of that finer gauge wire. The finer gauge wire has come over the top of the outer, down the centre, so it needs to come up and underneath the inner frame wire, like so. I'm going to give that a pull and bring it back up through. And then what you can do is either post the end through between the 2 wires, or you can take the leading edge through, whichever works for you best. So we're just going for 1 pass of wire around the inside section. If that's a bit loose, you can just tighten that up by drawing it through before returning. Let's take the end through, and we're going to do 3 tight wraps around the outside. 1 and 2 and 3. So again, it's just a figure of 8 weave. You can tighten those up if you need to, like so. And then the tail goes underneath that inner frame wire, up inside the frame, and draws through. Back down between the 2, the inner and the outer frame. Make a nice kind of slanted design, slightly angled design with the single pass of wire, and then we return to wrapping 3 times around the outside. That's 1, that's 2, and that's 3. Now if you misjudge the length of wire that you have used to add these 2 pieces together, don't worry, you can just simply finish on a 3 here and then start on a 3 a couple of moments later. You could even disguise it by hiding your end of the wire at a point such as where one of the branches come into position. So you continue weaving all the way around until you get to top center. and then you can finish off the bail exactly however you want to. So on this design, the outer wire became a fancy woven bail, and the inner wires simply turned back on themselves, just truncated to around about 4 or 5 millimeters, and the wire comes back in a hook shape. You can see that really nicely just there. And on this one, the inner wire ends up as a coil, both front and back. So, sorry, that's the outer wire, beg pardon. The inner wire creates a wrapped loop sitting up at the centre, and then the outer wire just had a coil turned on at the front over the gubbins of your wrapped loop. So there's nothing special about that. Very, very standard jewellery making technique. I've shown you many times how to create a bail with multiple wires. If you have any particular questions, as always, do feel free to ask in the comments afterwards. It's just a case of deciding whether you want to use the inner frame wire or the outer frame wire, or both of them. You've got lots of choices about how you can finish that off. Well, thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you've had a lovely time, and I hope that you enjoy making your Sakura tree and pagoda into your beautiful wall art. Doesn't really matter what gemstone you use, whether they're round beads, whether they're even gemstones. They could be beautiful pinky hues to represent the Sakura colours of spring in Japan. Could be whatever you fancy. You could even take that through to autumn and add some reds and browns as well. Have yourself a beautiful day, and I look forward to coming back and seeing you here on YouTube again very soon. Bye for now.